Dear teacher, dear students, today I am going to present the mind map I made focusing mainly on housing throughout the Middle Ages. My research question was, what were the functions and features of medieval housing throughout the social ranks? As a rule, different social ranks, I will be focusing on peasants, preachers, noblemen, and the king, lived in different types of houses. Each group had their own needs, and each needed a house to fit them. This resulted in drastically different features, as well as similar ones between these houses. Without further ado, let's get started with the lowest rank, peasants. Peasants lived in small cottages or farmhouses in less densely populated areas. They didn't need much, and frankly, weren't allowed much either. They mostly worked on fields and for their landlord. Peasants definitely didn't live life in the lap of luxury, and this reflected on their housing. Their houses mostly served two functions: to suit their agricultural lifestyle and to help shelter their belongings during the winter. Focusing our attention on the agricultural side, these village houses needed to be built for self-sufficient serfs and tenants. Two main features fulfilled this function: the garden and the animal shelters, each ideally settled right outside the house. In the garden, peasants kept bees for harvesting honey and herb gardens for picking herbs. The amount and type of herbs differed throughout Europe. For these peasants, the house itself provided shelter from storms or the bitter cold of winter. The family ate and slept on the ground with the animals they had to bring inside for winter, mainly cows, sheep, and goats. Christian preachers, this part of the presentation will be centered around monks, are situated second from the bottom in the social hierarchy. They played an irreplaceable part in medieval history as Christianity grew into the religion it is today. Though their beliefs were centered around minimalism, they also had a fair few requirements when it came to monasteries. Life in the monastery wasn't always about religion. Medicinal aspects of monastery life included helping the sick or injured from a nearby village in the infirmary and running an apothecary. Responsibilities also included teaching children, rewriting manuscripts in the scriptorium, and having accessible libraries with educational books for students and monks themselves. The two features mainly with a religious function were the chapel and the library again. They held communal prayers in chapels, sometimes in the gardens too, and used religious scripts from the library for their sermons. Monasteries often sheltered travelers and had sleeping quarters for the monks. Agriculturally, monasteries were built for these self-sufficient monks. They had fields for harvesting, bee farms for making honey, and stables and pastures for horses and other cattle. Frankly, they had everything they needed. There were a lot of ranks among noblemen, but the most common is landlord. Landlords lived in manor houses in the center of the village with serfs and tenants working on his fields. Landlords were not the richest, but definitely had a lot of money. Their houses were bigger than the peasants and bigger than the preachers, for they weren't aiming to be humble about their home. To attract attention from passers-by and simply to show their power, the outer appearance made it very clear who the landlord was and how important he was. Another social aspect of these houses was the great hall, where huge banquets were held to show off the nobleman's wealth. Their actual house, not just their property, was where most of the landlord's administrative archives were kept and where his tax treasury was located. He didn't only need to collect tax, though, and landlords also had a storage room for produce tax and food they owned. Stables and kennels were also located on the grounds of the manor house and housed horses and hunting dogs for various hunting expeditions. Castles were easily the biggest settlement in any medieval country. This meant that it had the most features and the most functions. It was shelter to the king himself and his closest noblemen, soldiers, and knights, and then workers who worked in the town below. This could mean carpenters, woodworkers as a whole, servants to the king, farmers who work on the royal fields, shoemakers, and blacksmiths. Administratively, it has the same features as a nobleman's house, only a bit more important. This includes a bigger collection of archives and the royal treasury. The courtyard and feast hall are the features with social functions worth mentioning. The courtyard and massive gardens were generally used for tournaments, announcements, and royal parties. The feast hall, along with the ballroom, were also used for socializing and having parties. Castles could also be considered a military base in some sense. It had sleeping quarters for the highest honor knights and training areas. It also had a moat for keeping opposing military forces away, thick walls, the terrain on which the castle was positioned, and a drawbridge with the same function. These last four could also be labeled under defense. Here is my source list, and that is the end of my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you all learned something.